Hello, everybody. David Parsons here. This is a new episode of The Nostalgia Trap. I am very pleased and happy that you're listening to the show and very excited to bring the guest I have today to you, into your ears, and hopefully her thoughts into your mind as well. Her name is Erin Bartram. She had a kind of flash of internet fame for a kind of odd thing, and a sad thing, I think, for her to kind of attain this fame with this viral article she wrote. She wrote an article that on her blog a few weeks ago called "The Sublimated Grief of the Left Behind," and it's about the kind of stuff that we've talked about on the show. It's come up a few times, probably not enough, honestly, but the idea that history as a discipline, particularly American history, and the pursuit of a Ph.D. in history is a discipline that is drying up in terms of tenure track jobs and the ability of graduate students in history to maintain employment after they get PhDs. So, that's certainly been in my experience, and I've brought this story up on the show, and my story has come up, will definitely come up during the conversation I had with Erin that you're about to listen to. But either way, the idea that there is a whole kind of army of contingent labor in academia called adjuncts that are doing most of the heavy lifting of teaching in colleges, while there is this shrinking elite of tenure track full-time professors, and they're pitted against each other. And we do talk about that politics, that kind of inter and intra-department politics of a bunch of part-timers getting paid next to nothing to do the same job in the same room as the full-timers, and those adjuncts hoping one day they'll get that full-time position and be able to ignore the adjuncts too. So it's a really awful, the labor politics and the wider politics of academia are really, really awful for those that don't know about them. But I have a feeling that a lot of people who listen to this show are in academia, or at least have been around the university and know a little bit about this stuff. But Erin's article, kind of deals with the emotional elements of coming to terms with leaving a discipline that you've spent years and years reading books about and engaging in work and becoming a real academic, and having to leave that behind, and where you go from there is a big mystery, because we do get into the whole idea of the alt-ac career path, or the alternative academic career path, which is something, I'm trying to do myself in many ways. I mean, I'm sitting here with a Patreon and a podcast. You can find that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And the reason I have my Patreon, and the reason I have part-time jobs teaching SAT courses right now, is because I haven't got a tenure track job in U.S. history. And quite frankly, I don't think I'm going to get one. I look and apply for jobs all the time. I mean, I've been on the job market for a long, long time. I have 2 published books. I studied history at the CUNY Graduate Center. I graduated from there with distinction on my orals. I did all the things that I was supposed to do. But one of the things that me and Erin discuss in this conversation is the class element. The fact that both of us, both me and Erin, come from working class backgrounds, of people that did not go to college, or certainly go onto graduate programs in the humanities. And as a result, we felt behind with our colleagues when we got there. I was going to school with people that already had master's degrees, whose parents maybe had master's degrees, and who kind of knew the whole game. And both of us felt like we were really catching up, and I think that handicapped us for sure. But, there's the emotional element, but there's also, for me, I guess this is an emotion too, a kind of resignation and anger about the career path I chose. I'm happy that I'm a historian. I'm happy that I studied history. I'm happy that I got my degree, but at the same time, I thought I would end up with some sort of job security. Instead, I'm sitting here asking people to give me $5 a month on the Patreon for my podcast, because I do want to share the stuff I know, and I want to share the people that I've met and what they know too. And I think all that stuff is important. I still believe in the project of academia, but to be really corny about it, the project of academia doesn't believe in me anymore. And it's not about me, and it's not about Erin. Both of us, our experiences are indicative of a much wider problem in American culture and society, in which higher education has been targeted and targeted by the forces of capitalism and neoliberalism to turn it into a place whose focus is on making money instead of educating the public and creating the kind of educational environment that once was, I think, a bigger public value in American life and has dwindled for many reasons in the past few decades. But either way, I had a really great and fun conversation with Erin Bartram. I hope you enjoy this, and kind of I hope it makes you think a little bit about kind of the university itself and the values of our society, because I think it's reflective of something much wider than that. Maybe an AM, FM episode about that eventually. But this is a great conversation, and you can find more Nostalgia Trap stuff at nostalgiatrap.com. And please, if you're able to, throw me a few dollars. $5 a month as a subscription to the show will get you some stickers and buttons that I send out intermittently. I would say quarterly I send out a package of stuff. But if you just want to support the show, that would be really helpful to me. So that's patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. You can press become a patron and donate as much as you want a month. Really, really helpful. And again, tells me that people care about these issues because sometimes it feels like they don't. So do check out Erin Bartram's article. You can find it on, they actually republished it on Chronicle. It was a huge thing. I would be surprised if you haven't seen it. But it's called The Sublimated Grief of the Left Behind. And the article that they kind of developed into one that they published on Chronicle is called Why Everybody Loses When Someone Leaves Academia. So enjoy this conversation. This is me speaking with historian Erin Bartram. I guess a good way to start would be to think a little bit and talk a little bit about this piece that you wrote that went like hugely viral over the last couple weeks. And it's part of, maybe you could explain, because I think there are probably a lot of people that listen to this show that might not know what this little genre, this little mini genre called quit lit is in academia and what that means.
Yeah. So in many senses, I didn't particularly mean my piece as quit lit in terms of this is my piece and I'm saying it to the world. I had in fact meant this mostly for my friends and colleagues, which is why the original version of the piece has a lot about that got cut out when it was later republished. Quit lit, I think, as a genre, is written by people who are leaving academia, and I think framing it as quit lit is sort of a problem. It's mostly people who are making the decision not to keep persisting in a system where they are contingent labor. There is some quit lit that is written by tenure track professors or even tenured professors who are leaving sort of toxic departments and things like that. But mostly it's a genre written by people who have decided for whatever reason, at whatever point, they will no longer continue participating in this particular labor system. Yeah.
And your piece caught my eye at a moment where, I moved across the country in the last year after, being an adjunct. I was an adjunct in New York for 10 years. Quit that genre, and I think you're right. Like quit lit is kind of a cringy term for it, but either way, it kind of captures this. I don't know. There's something really profound to me about the fact that there's this identifiable genre of pieces that people write, where they're kind of leaving something that meant so much to them, and not only meant so much to them, but was something they dedicated so much time in their life to. It definitely rings true with a lot of my experiences in academia, and it's still something that, I'm still kind of half adjuncting and deciding what I'm doing, and all those options that people threw at you about like private high school and all that stuff. I'm still considering all of that stuff, but it's really it's still hard coming to terms with the idea of not being in the profession that I kind of set my sights on many years ago. I wanted to kind of go I wanted to kind of go back and maybe hear your development as a historian. When did you I guess I like to kind of understand a little bit about my guests' youth and what drew them to history. Were you always into history as a kid, or is it something that developed later, or where did history become a kind of interest for you?
This is probably not the super inspiring story that many of my colleagues would have. I mean, when people ask me why did you major in history, the reasons that I give are not particularly good. I cannot remember actually why I picked history. It was not my best subject. I mean, I liked it.
Right.
But one of the notable things is I actually was much better at math, but I have dyslexia. It's particularly bad with numbers. The most terrifying thing you can ask me to do is, which once happened to me in a job and it was awful, is read a column of 3-digit numbers out. And in high school, I was fortunate enough to have really good math teachers who sort of accepted that if I swapped numbers at a stage of the problem, they would run it out.
Right.
So I was actually really good at that, and I really liked the conceptual work of that, but I also knew that this would be a problem and I wouldn't be able to get around it. And I think I put history down because I don't really know why. And then I happened to, I had mostly in high school and in grade school even focused on music. By the time I finished high school, I played 5 instruments and sang. I didn't think about going on in music, and I happened to, all the courses that I put down as a freshman were already taken, and I got put in a music theory class, and at the end of the first one, the professor said, did you ever think about just majoring in this? So I added that as a major, and mostly focused on that part all through college. I was fortunate enough to do a seminar at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, where I went to college. So I went to College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, and I did a seminar there. I had mostly been interested in medieval history, and I did a seminar there on diaries and private writing, and got to do some of my first documentary editing work there. My first citation came from a piece that I wrote there, and I really liked that. But I was still really committed to medieval history, and mostly committed to performing in a bunch of ensembles and being in that world. And considering at that point going on and doing a Ph.D. in music theory, which would have been, if anything, less viable than the Ph.D. I ended up doing. And then that I had this seminar, and I really liked it, and I was persuaded to apply for a big sort of, I can't say fellowship because that's not what it was, but essentially Holy Cross used to give 2 seniors in every class the chance to take no classes and do a big research project. And my advisor and I built a whole project out of the work I'd done at AAS, and I applied for that, and I didn't get it, and I was told afterwards they'd given the previous one to somebody in music, and the one before had gone to somebody in history, I was not going to fly for the social science where they met. But it sort of led me to, maybe I want to do U.S. history, and then I ended up doing my an honors thesis in my senior year on a colony, as it was called, of Jewish immigrants who were placed in my hometown as part of one of these large charity organizations in the city in New York to essentially get Eastern European Jewish immigrants out of the city, and they had been sort of, quote unquote, given all of these really nice mortgages for all of this great land, and then settled on the part of my town in Connecticut that had been the original settlement before English settlers had been like, this is the worst land, we're moving into the valley.
Wow.
And so all of these Jewish immigrants had been put there, and I sort of did the thesis on reconstructing this colony, but also thinking about how and why it had disappeared from parts of the collective memory of the town, and how it was still remembered by sort of various constituencies. And so by that point, I was applying for PhDs in medieval history, and had already sort of figured out I didn't want to do that, but I didn't. It was sort of too late at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you so at some point, I mean, were you always thinking that you were going to end up in graduate school? Where did your parents go to graduate school? Was academia
No.
something that was part of your family history at all?
No, and that's in fact I think one of the biggest things that I want to maybe do a little more writing and talking about. No, not at all. And I think that meant that I was deeply unprepared for lots of parts of academia.
Yeah.
I
bring that up because I feel the same way, and that was one of the parts that I was most curious about reading your piece, because that was my experience. I come from a family that I'm one of the first generation to go to college at all, and so winding up in a Ph.D. program, becoming an academic makes me very inexperienced in coming into graduate school. I had really no background in what to expect at all.
Yeah, no, I'm both inexperienced in the world that I found myself in, and simultaneously incomprehensible to the world that I grew up in.
Right. Right.
I mean, I know that if for most people, particularly this is bolstered by media depictions, that there's this idea of Connecticut as Fairfield County, that everybody from Connecticut lives this sort of very Tony life.
Yes.
Lots of 5-4 and a door houses and all this kind of stuff. That's not actually what Connecticut's like. So I grew up in the northwest corner of Connecticut in a very, very rural place. It is still now. It would be a good 45 minutes to get to a road that had more than 2 lanes. But we do have a train that goes to the city. So in fact, I'd been to New York more than I'd been to Boston. I'd never even been to Rhode Island until I was in college because it's so far.
Right.
It's a direct route across the state. So, no, in fact, I'm sort of in a weird position because, both of my parents don't have bachelor's degrees. They have degrees in things that aren't what they do. They're both I have had parents who punched a clock, who wore uniforms, but I didn't think of myself as working class in any way growing up, partially because of the way that we think about the working class as actually not necessarily an urban phenomenon, but tied distinctly to certain occupations.
Yep.
I remember seeing my FAFSA, and that was the first time I knew how much money my parents made together.
Yeah.
And I was stunned. And then when I went to college, that was when I realized that I wasn't middle class. And it's actually one of the ways that I used to explain to my students the difference between social and cultural history. How do we explain this many people are middle class, this many people believe that they are middle class? And there are complicated
That's
reasons
great.
for that.
I'm gonna steal that. That's really great.
That there are reasons why people who are lower middle and working class say that, and there's reasons why people who make much more say that. I'm also quite aware that all of these lines of class, if we just look at income, are meaningless because I live in a state where things cost a lot of money, and my salary maybe isn't as great as people think. But no, I didn't have any of that, and in fact, my family is sort of a weird combination of all of the social directions in the American past. On my father's side, my grandmother immigrated from Ireland in the 1930s, and my grandfather was the descendant of people who came from England in the 1680s, and both of them worked their entire lives my grandmother was a maid, and my grandfather was a milkman and a janitor and a security guard. And then on my mother's side, you go 3 or 4 generations back, and her family in France at the turn of the century owned a steamship line.
Wow.
And then, and yet, so there are in some ways.
You've done some deep family research, it sounds like.
Well, how I sort of found some of this out. One thing was weird. So when I was living in New York for a while, after undergrad, before I went to grad school, I was working for the National Park Service, and so I had been given Park Service housing, which was at Fort Wadsworth, which is the Coast Guard base on the northern side of Staten Island, where where the Staten Island Tower of the Verrazano Bridge is.
Yep.
And I was getting on the bus to go to the ferry in my first week there, and my mom said, "Oh, I think your grandmother's family lived around there. Their house was called Shore Acres." And I was like, "Okay, but that's the name of the bus stop that I get on at." And then I discovered, they had apparently basically owned the top part of Staten Island. You know, none of that had ended up kind of where I was.
Right.
Either in money or sort of social awareness or status. And that's because having a lot of the academic status world is actually quite separate from any of that world of status that they had lived in. So I had no real understanding of what any of this was, and I'm not even really sure that I knew what I was thinking the first time I applied to grad school, right out of college, which obviously I didn't go to. And then I went and did weird things for 2 years before I went back to grad school.
I think we all have that period. I had a similar period. In fact, when I got out of undergrad, I graduated in 2000. So in those weird years where I was doing weird things, what 9/11 happened in there, and it kind of made me think like very deeply about what I was doing and what American history was, and sent me spinning into applying to graduate school without really knowing too much about what I was in for.
Yeah, and I graduated from high school in 2000, and so I was a sophomore in college for 9/11, and then of course I came out into what was already not actually a terrific economy in a lot of ways. And I worked for a while. I had been all through college. I had worked for a rare bookstore in the town near where I grew up, and I continued sort of working there. I tried for a while. I worked doing kind of for a marketing firm in the city, doing training people who just had websites built for them, like how to actually keep your website up to date. And I did that for a while. I did lots of weird things, and then I got a job, a temporary position, working for the National Park Service in New York City, which is why I moved down there. And so I worked at Governor's Island, which was a brand new park at that point. And, you know, really did a lot of research to help write the first tours, and it was great, and I loved it. And when my position ended, they wanted to find a way to keep me. And of course, once you can get into federal government work, that's pretty good.
Right.
But the problem was it was 2005, and I was essentially never going to be able to compete with a flood of veterans who got preference for a position that was incredibly desirable.
Right.
And so initially my desire to go back to grad school was partially so that I would have an advanced degree and could maybe get back into the Park Service. And then, you know, my Park Service job ended. I worked as an author's assistant. I worked at the Strand. I lived the kind of, you know, moved back to Connecticut for grad school with about $35 to my name.
Yeah.
And very quickly, even though I had come back for this reason, there were a whole lot of my classmates who'd come in who definitely wanted to get a Ph.D. And very quickly, they decided they did not. And I decided, oh, wait, this is what I actually like to do. And I think I had become a different enough person in the 2 years I'd been out of college to be able to know that this was the thing that I wanted to do, but lacking the context for what grad school actually meant and what academia was. I didn't realize that wasn't enough.
I might be drawing the wrong conclusion from the fact that you worked at the Strand, but is there an element of because it certainly is with me and still is, but it was certainly a driving force, but an element of romance or romanticization of the academic life, and kind of thinking like you wanted to go, like school for school's sake seemed like something you wanted, or a space you wanted to inhabit?
I mean, I think that there may have been some of that, and also let's be quite fair. You know, I came in with a lot of really, really good people because the economy was terrible. I mean, and the Strand is actually a really good example of that. I mean, other than academia, I'm not sure that there's actually a place where you could find as many low-wage workers who are so overeducated for the job that they have. I mean,
I've always noticed that. Yep.
I'd worked in 2 libraries, and I'd worked in a rare bookstore. And not like a rinky-dink rare bookstore. Like, I have held and sold some truly amazing stuff. I remember one day my boss came back with a bunch of books that he found at a rummage sale, and one of them was a copy of The Wasteland.
Wow.
And we were like, oh, I wonder if this is one of those ones. And sitting there with him and figuring out that this book that he had purchased for 25 cents was not only one of the limited run of The Wasteland that Leonard and Virginia Woolf had hand-printed at Hogarth, but that it was, in fact, one of, like, the first 4 or 5 that had typos that they hadn't noticed.
Good Lord.
You know, so I had all this, like, really interesting and good experience, and I was probably, having gone to Holy Cross, which was, at that time, a pretty good liberal arts college, I was probably the bottom of the barrel in terms of the educational level and experience of all of my colleagues. And we were all just paid minimum wage for toting books around. It was my first union job.
Yep.
But boy, that hadn't done much to make that lunchroom a place that I wanted to be in. It was really scary. And so I basically spent all my time breaking my back, carrying stuff up and down ladders, not even getting to use any of the skills that I had, and eating peanut butter and fluff sandwiches, sitting in Union Square, kind of thinking, oh, well, this is what all of my education has been for.
Yeah.
And it did mean, though, that I could at least use my employee discount to get some of my seminar books before I moved to Connecticut. But I think I don't even know that I could have fully romanticized it, because I don't even know that I knew what it was enough to romanticize it. I mean, I did think, oh, I'm good at this, but I did actually know by that point, not just that I'm good at school, but I like to do the kind of research and thinking that is part of history. I just didn't really know about the rest of it.
Yeah, so let's get into the rest of it a little bit. I mean, I think what you mean by the rest of it is kind of, or what I think you mean is the kind of particular politics of academia, and the kind of internal politics of academia, and how all of it functions, and particularly how jobs work, both while you're in graduate school and then after graduate school. That's stuff that I honestly, and this will make me sound maybe really naive, but I didn't even know what an adjunct was before I started graduate school. And within 6 months of starting graduate school, I was an adjunct and thrown into this really kind of tumultuous world of labor politics that I was at the City University of New York, so I was at the CUNY Graduate Center. So that place is kind of rife with the kind of awful adjunct politics that I'm sure you encountered as well. But what was your first, if you can remember, what was your first kind of encounter with the politics of academia and all that other stuff you mentioned?
So when I went back, I think there are a couple things that might be important to know, and a good reminder of how quickly things change.
Yeah.
I was recently, in the past couple of months, having a discussion about, how do we warn students better before they go do this, and there was a discussion about sort of like, why would students be willing to take, $15,000 a year in health insurance? And I sort of had to remind people, when I went back to grad school, or when I went to grad school in 2006, $15,000 a year was better than many of my friends were doing. Like, it's not like people had really great jobs. But also, it was before Obamacare. I hadn't had health insurance since the second they put my degree in my hand, which meant that one of my doctors had to essentially commit some kind of insurance fraud for me to be able to get the asthma medication that I needed.
God. Basically,
they wrote a prescription to my sister, and my mom filled it out. Went and filled it and mailed it to me so that I could keep breathing.
Yeah.
So, in fact, the access to health insurance in 2006 was incredibly important to me. And at that point, I was actually UConn, which is where I went, had a funded master's, but funding meant that I got $9,128 a year.
Yikes.
As a master's student, and then when I was a PhD student, when I reapplied and was a PhD student, it went up to, I think, about 14,000.
Mm-hmm.
And but it was still, I liked it. I wasn't upset. But I do remember the first time I became really aware of how big the gap was. I mean, I think there were two examples, and I can't remember which year, whether it was my first or second year, one of these happened. But we were having the big department Christmas luncheon, which in our department was always Indian food. And I was sitting talking with a bunch of people and faculty members and grad students, and one of the faculty members asked, how much do you guys actually make a year?
Mm.
And I just sort of thought, how can you not know this? And of course, I could tell exactly how much I made a year. And I knew that this particular professor, like most of my professors, had gone somewhere where that would not have been the stipend that he had received.
Right.
So there was that moment of, if you are paying people this little, you should at least be aware of it. And then at the end of my first year, I remember standing in a little cocktail reception after the end of the year ceremony where everybody gets their awards and stuff. And a faculty member asking me what I was doing for the summer. And I said, working. And through the first year of grad school, all the way up through my exams, I actually worked in the archives and special collections, processing collections, and at the reference desk. And so I said to this faculty member, I'm working here at the Dodd Center. And the faculty member said, wait, for a living?
Huh. Wow.
And I was like, what did you think no, for fun? Like,
yeah,
of course,
right.
For a living. I have no money. What do you think?
Oh, it's insane.
Honestly, what do you think? And I don't know whether it was just this person was also unaware of how much money we earned, or that we didn't have summer funding, which we didn't have, which is, I think, a huge thing to be considered, or that I somehow had independent wealth or savings to live off of. It was just one of these moments of I was like, what the hell kind of world are we both living in here?
Two very, very different worlds, and one that, I mean, I always, it's funny because, like, part of me, I always assumed, maybe I didn't assume, but at least my hope was, well, I'll eventually be in that place to be that, I'll be in the position to be that tone deaf eventually. Like I'll graduate into being a professor, a full-time professor somewhere, and have that job, and hopefully won't forget what it was like to be a graduate student. But my experience in graduate school is entirely about that. Even the professors who were labor politics professors, labor history professors, they still they seem to have very little understanding of really how day to day and paycheck to paycheck it was for the graduate students.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, I've been thinking a lot about how much we don't like to talk about money, and how much the field puts an emphasis on sort of, there's a lot of, it's not the place you went to, it's the project you did and all this kind of stuff, but the inability to grasp the way that the variety of funding levels and class backgrounds of people coming in shapes the projects that they're actually able to do. Like, I would have really loved to just do all my dissertation research in one summer. I did not have the funding to do that, and so I essentially spent Christmas breaks and spring breaks and part of every summer for quite a while doing all of this research. I couldn't just sort of sit down and do it, and I couldn't do it till after my exams because we didn't have summer funding for people. And then it makes a difference to have to wait till your fourth year to start doing real research. Than to be able to do it after your first year in grad school. That actually profoundly shapes the project that you do and what you're able to do. That these things are actually really, really important.
Yeah. And the stuff that you're required to do to kind of build yourself as a scholar is, I'm thinking about like going to conferences, for instance, like that. Going to conferences, it's one of the great, I guess, regrets, although I still don't see a way how I could have done it, but I never really went to that many conferences, and I saw lots of my colleagues going to lots of conferences, and I like the idea of paying for flights and hotels and all of that in the middle of the semester seemed like just absolutely impossible to me. It wasn't a financial possibility.
I mean, I probably did a few more conferences than most people. I think historians are sort of lucky in the sense that our major conference for the field in America is, for better or worse, starts the Wednesday or Thursday after New Year's.
Right.
So it's over a break, and there have been times that I've been able to sort of smush it onto something. Some of the affiliated conferences that I'm a part of did affiliated sessions, so I could sometimes get funding from the department. I've noticed a trend towards asking tenured or tenure-track faculty to donate money essentially toward a grad student fund to help fund grad travel. I, in fact, had far more access to travel funds as a graduate student than I did as an adjunct. And, I went to 3 conferences last year, 3 not insignificant conferences. I went to the American Historical Association, the Berkshire Conference on the History of Women, and U.S. Intellectual History. I probably had to spend $4,000 of my own money easily
Insane.
on that travel.
Yeah.
And one of them was one I could drive to. I drove from here to Hofstra for the Berks. And one thing that I chose not to do, which some of my peers did not, is I sort of explicitly said, I'm not going into debt to do this research. And there was a push to do that. And had I gone into debt, I could have maybe done the research a little faster. I don't actually think that would have made that big a difference. People say, apply for fellowships. I mean, I don't have to go into detail, but there was, in fact, I did most of my research at one archive. It is a massive archive in New England for American history. A jillion people apply for these fellowships every year. I applied 5 times, probably. Every time I was there, archivists said, your project's so great, you should apply for this fellowship. I did every year, and I never received one. And even then, it would have been 6 weeks. It would have been nothing compared to what I needed to do there. So, I mean, I've been doing this thing where you sort of peel back and try to figure what was the point at which, not I went wrong, but the point at which it was sort of not actually going to be feasible, or the point at which I lost control over what it was.
Yeah.
And pretty far back.
The idea of the job market too is something that I didn't really know about, and I remember maybe my first year, and this would have probably been around 2004, 2005. I heard some older graduate students who had been in the program for a couple of years. I overheard them talking in the department kind of little lobby we've got there.
Lounge area.
Yeah, the department lounge got a little coffee table and a few books around that kind of thing. And then they were talking about the job market, and they were saying, we're going to have to leave. There's no way we're going to be able to stay in New York. We're going to have to go accept jobs out in the prairie somewhere, in the middle of the country or somewhere far away, and we're going to have to do our penance out there for years and years. And I kind of didn't really even know what they were talking about. I didn't get that they were talking about having to travel and move their lives to take literally any full-time job because they're so scarce, particularly in American history. Yeah.
As one of the faculty members sort of told me, when you're in grad school, you have these fantasy ideas about where you'd like to teach, and that when you're on the job market, a tenure-track job at East Jesus Tech, which was his sort of generic term for combining all sorts of things that you may not have, in fact, imagined for yourself. And I was never the sort who was, I've gotten a lot of pushback on the piece because I didn't talk about teaching in this piece that went viral, whereas if anyone knew me at all in the historical community already, it was for my sort of work in pedagogy, and I have a piece I have to finish this afternoon to go up on a pedagogy blog. But there was a lot of sort of, you only want to be at an R1 and you need to apply elsewhere. Like I hadn't. There were 10 jobs in my field. I applied for all of them. In fact, the only one I didn't apply for was one that was very clearly at an elite university, not just because I had no chance of getting it, but also because I was like, I actually do not want to do that much research. I don't care that much about this. I am not willing to try to give that many shits about this topic to do that kind of work. And I, in fact, know people who have found themselves in these positions who are like, I didn't really want to be here, and this is actually a little too too much. But I also think it's useful, and this is not a medium where I can display it, but if you look, and the new historian's job report, the AHA's report on jobs in the field just came out yesterday, which makes this even more bleak. But I sort of frequently ask people to look at the chart that the American Historical Association puts out of number of new PhDs versus advertised job openings. And essentially, what you see is right in essentially 2006. I mean, it's even a little bit before the recession, but basically with the recession, the number of job ads absolutely cratered.
Yeah.
So right when I was going into grad school, and the number of PhDs went up, and in the next couple of years, so in the first few years of my program, actually there was a bit of a rebound, and everyone thought, oh, it's getting better. This was just that people freaked out in the recession, and it's going back up. And then every year, basically looking at this since about 2012, the number of jobs offered every year has gone down. The one that just came out yesterday showed that last year's job market was like the worst since the early 80s. And last year's job market was good compared to what I found this year. And so there's both this long-term trend and also big surprise that the recession allowed the sort of corporate university to realize that, hey, we can just hire people as modules of teaching.
Yeah.
And that's fine.
Yep.
And of course, sort of why would they not? So I taught heavily as a grad student, and I kind of already understood my role there in providing this cheap service to the university. So I had already had an introduction to that, and then as in the middle of my dissertation, my home university, to save money, essentially tried to squish in more teaching in certain programs, and also took away the graduate health insurance. We had the opportunity to buy into the same plan that faculty were on, and then we were put on the plan that was provided for undergraduates, which you can imagine was in fact not the kind of insurance needed by people in their 20s and 30s.
Oh yeah. Wow.
And so I ended up very quickly on the organizing committee for a union drive, and was part of, I think, the fastest higher education union campaign in U.S. history.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Yeah, I saw one of your tweets. I think it might have been from this morning. That was kind of citing that idea. That like kind of I know about the teaching market, and you know about the kind of politics of being a graduate student very intimately, because you were paid so poorly. You ended up very quickly helping unionize your coworkers, which is pretty incredible.
Yeah, and that was, I think, I think that experience combined with the fact that my degree is a thing that teaches me to look at how individuals function in larger cultural structures. I think that's one of the more galling things about some of the responses to the piece that I wrote,
right.
Is just the absolute resistance of some people who dedicate their lives to talking about structures of oppression and really just sort of structures where there's not actually a lot of great choices. Who are just absolutely firmly committed to finding reasons why this was my fault. And it's why I wish in some ways that the piece that got so much attention had been written by somebody who went to a quote-unquote better program with a sexier degree, because it happens to those people too.
So can you mention some of the highlights of that? Because I imagine you got just a torrent of bullshit for this article from people from a whole range of perspectives that attack you. I don't read that stuff, so I don't want to read the comments. But what were some of the things they were saying?
Well, I do read the comments because maybe I'm a glutton for punishment, but I'm also sort of really fascinated by it. In many ways, much of the blowback was not surprising to me, because I saw when my friends and I put ourselves and put our energy on the line for this union drive. That's when you saw who that's when you saw who in the faculty got it and who didn't. And talking to faculty who were these sort of, who research like radical activists who were like, oh, we could do a petition, like maybe we could do that, but I don't know, that's really scary and we should maybe not do that.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
People who are tenured,
Mm-hmm.
The absolute hesitance to do any of this, and it had nothing to do with your age or your field or how you'd come up. My advisor was quite a senior scholar, and who had no qualms about me doing this, even though it was right in the middle of me writing my dissertation. So I'd heard a lot of these things before, and in fact, that time in the union and just being sort of an observant grad student meant that I understand a lot about how universities work. It's not that I don't understand; it's in fact that I do understand.
Right.
That has allowed me to say these things. And in fact, the stuff that really bothers me the most is the stuff that nobody has said to my face, and because it's all being said in back channels. And I've had enough. I've heard from enough sort of friends who are sympathetic to me and who are on the bubble or who are independent scholars, that there are plenty of tenured track scholars who are saying all of the, well, it's what can we do? It's not our fault. Blah blah. Administrators are making us do this, and not everybody can get a job, and it's not fair. And what do you expect? Like, this is just kind of the way things are. The comments in comment sections are about a person that is not me, so they don't bother me to read them.
Right.
It is fascinating to watch people try to imagine a version of me that can explain what happened.
And I'm sure there's all sorts of wonderful gendered elements to that too, and projecting all sorts of garbage on you.
Yeah, I'd love to know if male authors of Quit Lit, if it was assumed that they quit when they did because, as one commenter put it, she's probably on another kind of clock too.
Sweet Jesus.
I had said nothing in my piece about my marital status or my lack or having of children or any of that, because it was in fact not a thing. Because I didn't say it, it was assumed that I didn't have them, because of course if I were a woman, why wouldn't I talk about this kind of stuff?
Right.
So there's been that. There's been clearly I got a lot of, you're an entitled snowflake.
Mm-hmm.
And your project just wasn't good. Of course, you wrote about something stupid and blah, 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 and you're some kind of radical gender theorist, which is not true. A lot of people being like, stop complaining that you didn't get tenure, and I'm like, this is why what I do is important, because you would have been able to read this more critically and understand what it was saying. Not that I didn't get tenure. So all of these things are very much about, they're about a version of me that isn't real, but it's made me realize sort of how much most normal people, and I put normal in quotation marks to refer to people outside of the academy, in some ways, they have this weird picture of what academia is like, and it's both because it is its own weird world, and also because normal people actually cannot believe that a thing like this is what it is.
Yeah.
And having to explain my experience in grad school and sort of this decision I've come to, and the particulars of the position that I didn't get, which, there's all sorts of weird stuff. Having to explain that to people over and over again has helped me realize, like, man, I knew this was messed up, but it's really hard to have to explain to people and be like, well, yeah, but it is this way, and I'm not supposed to feel bad because it is this way. And people are like, that's terrible. But I think more broadly, there's still this sort of absolute terror that, or solidarity among people who made it.
Yep.
I mean, it's sort of this broader problem of, in America, it's deeply important that people in poverty are there because of their own choices, because if they're there because of things that they can't control, it means that my success is not also down to me being awesome.
Right.
That if we accept structures and luck as mattering when things go badly, we have to accept them in our own in our own lives, which has meant that as a sort of white woman from a working class background, but who can pass as middle and upper class, I've tried to be very kind of aware of that. But there's just sort of this, nope, it is the way it is, and I can't speak out. I have to preserve where I am, and I guess my thought is like, I don't really see at this point, has adjunctification fixed the problems it was going to fix? Has it saved the sort of tenured world of academia? Has giving up all faculty governance actually achieved anything, or has it made it worse? And if it hasn't fixed it, at a certain point, maybe think about punching up instead of punching down.
Yeah,
you have thrown a lot of us under the bus.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't make it better, and I get it that it's really scary. Imagine how much scarier it is for people who are in much more vulnerable positions, and much more.
Right.
Plenty of people do labor activism who are in much more vulnerable positions than I am, obviously.
Yeah, that's why I think that you're hitting on why the term quit lit is so bad a term, because it's not really quitting when the job market essentially collapsed underneath our feet while we were in graduate school. But also that we didn't really have a choice in the matter. It wasn't really about quitting so much as for me, like just taking a realistic look at those numbers that you just cited, and seeing that year after year there are no jobs for me to apply for, and the ones I apply for I don't even get an interview for, and basically coming to terms with the fact that I'm not going to get a tenure track job, and that to me was a hard thing to come to terms with, but one that seems very obvious. It's not something that that I really need to fight, because I don't have a choice in the matter. I'm not going to get a tenure track job.
Yeah, and I think that's the important thing, that we don't want to say there aren't jobs, because there's a lot of teaching that needs to be done, and I would very much love to see universities. I was talking to a colleague of mine who sort of was equating it to the way we talk about full-time equivalent students when we, put part-time students together so that we understand demographically how many full-time equivalent students there are. I'd like to see the adjunct rates at universities expressed in terms of how many tenure lines they would be.
Right.
Because there's plenty of teaching that has to be done, and we can talk about enrollment issues and maybe consider that, in fact, having a massively unstable teaching force contributes to enrollment numbers and consistency. I don't know. Maybe we could think using any of the tools we have been developing throughout our careers about this kind of stuff.
Yep.
But that this is the thing that bothered a lot of people about what I wrote. Other than saying I didn't care whether people thought my feelings were right, or as I put it, that my feelings were not subject to peer review, a whole lot of people were like, no, but they are, and let me tell you why they're wrong. And I was like, thanks.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you imagine you're the first person to tell me, a woman in academia, that my feelings are wrong.
Right.
But get in line, buddy. But the other thing that I said that apparently was so deeply offensive to people was that I thought my labor was worth more than I was being paid, and that I was unwilling to keep doing. I was unwilling to live in such a precarious situation, or if I was going to, it was going to be kind of on my own terms. That I saw someone say, we don't actually throw people out of the field. We just push them to the absolute brink in terms of financial and life stability, and then say they quit.
Yeah.
And then
judge them for quitting. Make it impossible for them to continue, and then judge them for quitting.
Well, yeah, and I kind of want to be like, okay, if I should have stayed in, if my position is actually so good and something that I was ungrateful to turn down, well, we could swap places. I mean, would you take it?
Yeah.
Blah blah, vocation and passion and dedication. The number of people who are really annoyed that I don't want to continue writing and publishing in the academic world. It doesn't earn you money, but it's supposed to sort of earn you a job that pays you well. And the people sort of saying, oh, well, this is why you didn't get a job, because you weren't passionate enough. Like, go suck an egg. Like, what are you
weren't
talking
passionate
about
enough.
at this point?
So I wanted to ask you about this, about all these suggestions that people have, because I'm imagining the most common response was this term that probably many people outside of academia, who you refer to as normal people, don't know anything about, but this thing called alt-ac, or the alt-ac track, the alternative academic careers track, which I started hearing about at some point. That was, I mean, it was presented to me as if like this was the hot new idea, which really just meant like go get a job that has nothing to do with what you studied. But what was alt-ac to you when you came upon this, and were there ever any moments that you kind of considered alternative paths?
I mean, this is, I think, the thing that nobody has wanted to confront. That alt-ac, which is it's the idea that with a PhD you can still do these other things, and not just that you can still do them, but the PhD and the PhD training you receive as a historian is not only related to but directly useful in other fields, and it's all the jobs you can get with a PhD. And I actually would love to see us reframe it as, what are the things you can do despite the fact that you have a PhD?
Yes.
So it is, well, you can go teach high school. And then the thing that I had to sort of push back against, my parents were like, can't you just go teach high school? And I said, well, I'm not trained in teaching high school history in a public setting. I'm not certified. It's actually really quite different from what I do. I have a lot of ideological hang-ups with teaching in a private school, some of which come from having grown up around a lot of the really big Connecticut ones. But also, I mean, that's not a thing that I ideologically can support, and I also don't particularly want to do it. So there's that.
And real quickly, public high school, a lot of people don't know this, but a lot of people have told me the same thing. Well, you have a PhD, just go teach public high school. And I'm like, well, that actually requires a credential from the state that you're in, and that credential takes upwards of a year, 2 years to get. So it's not something that you just like, and also it requires actually getting a job. They think that like I can go to the high school and say, hi, I have a PhD. What class do I teach? And it's just not that simple.
Well, yeah, this failure to understand that in fact it's both sort of. It's been leveled at me as though I am too elitist to go do these other jobs. So teach in a high school, work in a museum, public history of any variety, like I don't have that experience in my background, all this kind of stuff. I mean, there's been a lot of emphasis on like, well, if you can get great digital skills, you can do all sorts of other things. Yeah, those are much easier to develop as a grad student when you're at a university with a lot more money. Than mine was. Like, we just did not have the resources to do. I did a digital project with a colleague of mine, and I presented at a conference. It was, I think, held up at Simmons. I don't know, because I was booking there from having taught in the morning, which I guess my colleagues weren't doing. I was the only person at that conference from a public university, because the actual infrastructure needed to do these kinds of digital projects wasn't there. But that it's painted as though, like, by not going and doing these things, or by not realizing I could go do these things, I'm somehow being really elitist. And when, in fact, what I think I'm saying is those require expertise that I don't have because I was trained in this thing. There are problems in those fields as well. Like, for me to just think I could fall ass backwards into public history is a really obnoxious thing to say, and I've actually heard from a lot of people in public history who were very glad that I said, I'm not qualified. I'm not more
it's
qualified
the opposite of elitism.
It's
the way I see it, and to me, it's very condescending to say, "Oh, I can just go do something that other people already have a 10-year expertise in." It's not fair to them at all. No.
Yeah, me dropping in with my PhD, somehow I have all of these skills, which I absolutely don't. I mean, I think alt-ac. And there was a piece in the Chronicle yesterday, which was a weird sort of, I didn't know that it was appearing till it appeared in the morning. That was another, like, here are a bunch of sort of senior scholars talking about what they think my feelings were and all this kind of stuff. And there's this sort of like, oh, she's falling into despair. She doesn't realize her skills are useful in other ways. Like, no, I'm not stupid. I actually understand this, and I have counsel my students and I teach them how to talk about the skills that they have. I don't think we want to acknowledge that having a Ph.D. doesn't necessarily make you more hireable. It makes you less hireable and scary in some important ways. But that also, like, you trained me to be this thing.
Yeah, very specific thing.
Stop trying to avoid the fact that this is what this degree trains me to do. And if I could have gotten one of those other jobs without a Ph.D. 12 years ago, don't say that it's an alternative career for people with PhDs. Just because you happen to be able to get it and have a Ph.D. does not mean a Ph.D. was necessary for it. And what you're saying is, don't complain about the fact that you spent all of your 20s earning no money, because you can now go and get a job that you probably could have gotten with a BA.
Yeah.
Or that you couldn't have gotten with a BA. Like, just sort of stop with this framing.
They put it all on you, and that's what's hard. I think, I really like the fact that your piece kind of focuses on in part the kind of just abject grief of feeling sad about having. I mean, I'm a type of person who can very, very easily wallow in self-pity about this, and it's actually something I've had to battle back because I have huge student loans to pay back for a degree that I'm probably not going to end up is going to be necessary for whatever career I end up doing. I don't regret going to graduate school in the sense of how much it taught me and how much I learned, and the person I became and my understanding of the world is so much deeper because of that experience. But on the other hand, I don't have much to show for it. I'm still kind of adjuncting and holding on, like I said, and I'll see where it goes in the next few years. But I've got to move in a direction that will probably be away from what I studied and what I got my PhD in. So that's, and there's a sadness to that for sure.
Yeah, and I think many of us would say that same thing. People ask, sort of, do you regret this? And it's hard for me to say, if I could go back, I wouldn't do it. I mean, in some ways, I'd only say that if I could also forget the person I became because of grad school.
Right.
That the person I am because of what I did and my understanding of the world, it's a constant journey. But I don't think that the person that I was when I started grad school could have conceptualized the person that I am now in the way that I think about class and race and gender and sexuality and all these other important things. I think what's been really striking and painful for me at the end is to realize that in fact I have spent the past 11 years of my life with people and learning to be like people who can do those same things, who are so brilliant at unpacking all of this stuff and who do much more innovative work than I. Understanding some of the most painful parts of our national history and our history as a world, and to see how just fundamentally incapable they are of turning those lenses on themselves. I mean, it's just when
it's pretty striking.
I talk with my students all the time, and they really love to imagine that they would have been abolitionists or they would have been whatever. And we have to face the fact that they, unless they are black students in my class, it's very unlikely that they would have been. And one of them might have been, and everyone else would have thought that they were awful and a weirdo. And I guess to sort of see that I could be so transformed, but that in fact it was only the real vulnerability and precarity of how I ended up coming through the academy that apparently allowed me to be able to turn this lens on the system. That you can have all of these ways of thinking, but they are really uncomfortable to use on yourself and the system that you're in when you're benefiting from it. And I think that's what I'd sort of like people to be able to say, stop trying to find ways that it was my fault, because there's 1,000 other people that you could find who are more brilliant than I who've been chewed up and spit out by this. Just accept that it's an unfair system and that it continues because there is a need for cheap grad student and adjunct labor, and that, like, if you're going to benefit from it, just say it. Just be okay with it.
Yeah.
Just say, I got mine, and that's okay. But saying that, I think it's one of those things where the people who are so uncomfortable with it, they're not quite sociopaths enough to say that. And so you can't admit it, because admitting it would be painful. And I have, in fact, seen...
And would contradict their politics, too.
Yeah, and I've seen a significant outpouring of grief from people who know that they got there by the skin of their teeth, and who kind of know that this is exploitative. And when we think about consciousness, there among adjuncts, this is much more easy to kind of all understand. But I think there's this sense that there might be one or two people in a department who are really aware of this and how bad it is. But how many of those people do there actually need to be before something happens?
Yeah.
And that we're not apparently at a tipping point.
And that's true across so many industries. It's not just academia.
Yep.
I mean, this gap that you're describing that exists between this shrinking elite of full-time tenure-track professors and the massive underclass of adjuncts and graduate students that are just barely making it. That gap is both material and ideological, but it's one that but it's one that exists across the country in every industry, and one that I think is bridging that gap somehow is kind of key to overcoming all the kind of horrible things that neoliberal capitalism is doing to us. But at the same time, like, the fact that you're describing something, I think it's a really important point of this, is that these professors who just don't get it. The fact that they're professors that study this stuff and ought to be able to get it, that their understanding is somehow blocked because they're benefiting from the system, is such a scary thought. Because that if it can't be overcome by those people, by the radical historians, then how's it going to be overcome in any other place where there's not so much direct thinking about the system? It's really scary.
Yeah, it is very scary, and honestly, I don't know how much of it is. I mean, this is what we think about in the past too. How much of it is I literally cannot understand this, and how much of it is that if I actually comprehend this, it is going to tear down so many of the things that are important to me, and I will be in a position emotionally and personally where I can't keep doing these things with conscience. The ability to hold that off is sort of very important, and I mean that's why when people sort of, the interview with the Chronicle, they said, do you think that this is going to change anything? And I was like, no, I don't, because that's the thing. I mean, it's this idea that, like, oh, maybe if we just talk about it, everything will be fine.
Yes.
Like somehow nobody ever said slavery was bad, or nobody ever said the working class is being used as cannon fodder in World War I. Like,
right.
And that's the thing. How do you actually get to the point of doing something? And I think maybe academics are particularly beholden to the idea that maybe words can actually do something, and I think that they can.
Yeah. But talking is not enough. And that idea of we need to talk it out and listen to each other more is such a often like trite way of dismissing the real issues.
And frankly, as I sort of stated, I was the same writer and thinker before this. I wrote this in 20 minutes because I'd been thinking about it for a long time.
Right.
I had always been thinking these things and writing these things, and the fact that all of a sudden I'm sort of moderately interesting to some people because they can monetize me in particular ways is very obvious to me, and so it's actually been pretty easy to endure all this attention because I know that it is largely going to come to naught.
Right.
That I, in fact, don't have the connections because of how I grew up. I don't have the connections to leverage myself into some other, just go into publishing, just go into this kind of a thing. I can't do that. And then I'll probably largely fade away, and everybody can go back to being okay.
Right.
And in particular, not being so unsettled by having to be aware of someone's feelings. And I think that may be what separated mine from lots of others. Not that I wasn't talking about the system, but that I was always also sort of trying to talk very honestly about grief and loss and how the people who succeeded get by holding that stuff down. And the number of emails I've gotten that are like, this made me finally dealt with a thing from 25 years ago. It's a real problem. But people keep asking me, how would I fix it? I don't know. I wasn't good enough for you to give me one of these jobs.
Right.
So why are you asking?
Yeah.
Why are you asking me how to fix it?
Yeah.
You told me to go away. I got it. I got the message. Because that's the thing. If it's a merit-based system, I have been told quite clearly, you don't measure up. Why the hell should I know how to fix this system? If you think it's broken, fix it yourself.
Well,
if these
I don't hold out much hope that that's going to happen, but again, I think you're right. Like when letters this genre that we're calling quit lit pops up every now and again, and your piece is certainly the latest kind of burst of attention. It's a moment where everyone kind of looks and thinks about it and says, it's an important issue. I hope we do something about that, and then it fades away. Yep. Yeah. Again and again.
And to ask me what to do about it, I'm sort of like, can you stop asking me for more unpaid labor on my way out the door?
Yeah.
Like the emotional labor of bearing this over the past 2 weeks. I haven't been able to respond to people. It's been overwhelming for me to do this, and I'm like, yeah, sure, pile a little more on for me. In particular, a lot of my contacts have been from men who've been incapable of dealing with their feelings, and I just say, I'm glad I could help, but now that this scab has been picked,
right.
Learn how to deal with some of these things, and I'm gonna go do something else because I'm gonna stop getting paid and lose my health insurance at the end of May, and I gotta keep living because my landlord is a musician, and if anyone, he is not going to accept exposure as a rent payment.
Right. Yeah. And that exposure thing of going out there and create I remember one of my first years at in a fellowship program, they told us all that we should start working on our public persona and our kind of build up our digital persona and all this stuff that seemed very much like the language of entrepreneurial capitalism. It was essentially go build you, and it was all unpaid labor. It's stuff write a bunch of articles that you don't get paid for, make a blog, go do all sorts of conferences and things like that bring attention to yourself and build this kind of celebrity personality, because that's the only way you're going to make it. And again, that's something that's not unique to academia. I think everyone's being told to I'm sitting here with a podcast and a Patreon, so in many ways I'm participating in that for sure. Yep. And it's just kind of it's not a sustainable system. It seems insane, actually, to tell people that they should make celebrities of themselves, even as academics, because it's the only way you're going to get attention, and ultimately, maybe that'll lead to money at some point, which is such an insane thing to do, because who has the money and resources and time to do that besides people that are immensely privileged and have those resources already?
Yeah, I have been thinking an awful lot about the hustle required in grad school and the sort of entrepreneurial spirit and the world of adjuncting as the gig economy.
Yep.
In particular, investing a lot of money into, and obviously, I had an online presence and I'd already been writing and doing a lot of things, and it meant absolute nothing to me on the job market. But pouring all this money into conferences and research that I had no support for, so I had to pay for all the research I did this past summer for the process of turning my dissertation into a book. And I was just sort of thinking of the Uber driver who puts all of their own money into their car.
Yep.
And keeping it in good condition with this idea that somehow, this is why I kind of asked, to whom is the value of my labor accruing? Who is actually getting the thing here? And it's not actually is my labor valuable or not? The thing people don't want to pick at is the labor is valuable. They want it without paying for it. Like, people want the value of it without paying the person who's creating it. And maybe the problem was, and I'm sure some people would say this, like, I didn't have enough hustle.
Mm-hmm.
But, like, I'm sorry. I clearly I was massively naive, and I had parents who, in a weird way, they had both worked in the same place for my entire life, and that I sort of grew up in a place where you do your job, you do it well, and that means something. And I know that this is not an academic problem. This is it's a fantasy of the U.S. economy, but it's not actually a fantasy in some particular times and places and ways.
Right.
And that by the time I realized what the hustle was, I was probably already behind. And also, I just don't think that I could have. Like, I don't think that I had enough kind of slavish devotion and love to doing this that I would be willing in the long term to live like this. And I got to a certain point where I said, no, I can't.
Yeah, you can't make a sacrifice forever. Yeah.
And that is really offensive to people.
It is, and your story brings out a lot of emotions from a lot of different directions. But I wanted to thank you for spending doing another hour of unpaid labor and talking to me about it, because I think there are a lot of people who will find a lot of resonance with their own experience listening to your story. So thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's still very strange to me that anyone found any of this interesting. I'm still not really aware of. It's very odd to see myself talked about, like, by my last name in comment sections. Like, oh, that's me. You hit a nerve, and there is an army, and I think I've been finding them on this through sending this podcast out. There's an army of very angry people who share similar stories and similar experiences, for sure. Yeah, history helps you understand. I mean, I assume that it helps us understand our experience and the experiences of the past. And I think maybe the one thing that this has been able to do is allow people to give a name and a framework to a feeling that they've had. And I guess that's probably a pretty good thing.
It is. Thanks so much. I appreciate it. Have a good one. Take care.
You too.
Okay, I want to thank my guest, Erin Bartram. I had a really great time. It's a very unpleasant and sad subject to talk about, I think, for both of us. But she's such an articulate person when it comes to communicating the problem and why it's such a big problem in the university. So I hope you enjoyed that as much as you can, and I hope that we move our society in a way that starts to change these issues. Because for me, the idea that higher education is going away like this as a public value is something incredibly disturbing and part of a much wider trend that we need to challenge. So thanks so much. I appreciate it. Check out patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Throw me a few dollars if you don't mind. It would really help out. And we will see you again soon. Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.